What is mental fascination? Fascination means the act of fascinating, or state of being fascinated. The word fascinate springs from the Latin word fascinare, meaning to enchant, bewitch, charm by eyes or tongue, captivate, attract, etc. The definition of the English word fascinate is as follows: to act upon by some powerful or irresistible influence, to influence by an irresistible charm, to allure or excite, irresistibly or powerfully, to charm, captivate, or attract, powerfully, to influence the imagination, reason, or will of another in an uncontrollable manner, to enchant, captivate, or allure, powerfully or irresistibly. The above definition is condensed from a number of the best dictionaries and gives the cream of the idea embodied in the word. My definition. In this manual I shall use the term mental fascination in the sense of the action of a mental force that powerfully influences the imagination, desire, or will of another. This is my own broad definition, which includes all the varied phenomena of personal magnetism, psychological influence, hypnotism, mesmerism, charming, etc., etc., all of which I hold to be but varying phases of phenomena of one force. These things are all a bit of the same piece, in spite of the claims to the contrary on the part of those who did not like the relationship. The nature of the force. What is the nature of the force which produces that which we call mental fascination, which latter I have defined as the action of a mental force that powerfully influences the imagination, desire, or will of another? Mental fascination is the manifestation. What is the nature of the mental force that powerfully influences? As you will see in some of the following chapters, there have been many theories advanced to account for this force. The theories varying from magnetic fluids to mere simple suggestions on the part of the influencing person. Nearly every writer on the subject has had his own pet theory. But although these theories varied and differed greatly, the effects produced were about the same, which naturally leads us to look for some common basic principle operating under all forms, regardless of the many theories advanced by those producing the effects. It is the old story here, as elsewhere. A man finds that he is able to produce certain phenomena by certain methods. He works along practical lines for a time, endeavoring to perfect his methods and increase the variety and effectiveness of the phenomena. When he has advanced along these lines, he begins to look around him for a theory to fit the facts of the case, and here is where he usually makes his mistake. He evolves some fantastic theory, which seems to him to account for the effects produced, and then he endeavors to fit the facts into the theory. If the facts will not so fit in, well, so much worse for the facts, and he either discards the non-conforming facts, or else ignores or denies them. This has been the course of theorists since the beginning. After a while, some man of a more scientific mind examines the recorded facts and discovers the true underlying principle and reconciles the differing theories of the original theorists by a new synthesis which combines the true principles in all the other theories, discarding the pet hobbies or prejudices of the previous authorities. And so it is the case of mental fascination, as we shall see. I've explained the underlying force beneath all forms of mental magic, and mental fascination is one of those forms. It is the universal mentative energy, of which, and in which, each individual mind is a center of activity. I have also explained that the mentative energy of each individual mind is and may be transmitted from one person to another by means of mentative currents or waves, and that these mentative currents and waves tend to induce in the minds of other persons the emotions or feelings existing in the mental states of the person sending out the waves or currents. The mental poles. I have also explained that there are two mental poles, known as the motive and emotive poles, respectively, which manifest willpower and desire force, respectively. Desire force acts in the direction of drawing, pulling, attracting, luring, coaxing, charming, etc., while willpower acts in the direction of compelling, forcing, driving, impelling, commanding, demanding, etc. Desire always draws its object toward itself, while will always overpowers and compels its object, generally in the sense of driving it into action. In mental fascination, both desire force and willpower are employed, generally in combination. Desire force has been called the feminine phase of mentative energy, and willpower the masculine. And in this, as in everything else, the combination of those two qualities produces the most marked results.
This Chapter 2, Mental Fascination Among the Animals. Even before the human race was evolved, mental fascination was known instinctively to the lower forms of life. It is said that the cells in the blood of living things become aware of the presence of each other at distances which must preclude any theory of ordinary sense awareness. Not only do they recognize or sense the presence of each other, but they seem to be attracted toward each other by some force or fascination which must operate along the lines of desire and will. Eminent scientists inform us that even the atoms manifest an attraction for each other, varying in degree according to the nature of the respective atoms. And the same authorities tell us that this attracting operates along the lines of a desire for each other and a will which causes them to fly to each other. Is it not reasonable to suppose that in this instinctive manifestation of attraction and the response to attraction among the atoms, there is to be found the elemental principle of mental fascination? And are not the phenomena of electrical attraction and magnetic attraction related to the human phenomena by a long series of links in a grand chain? The two phases. But leaving the above questions without further consideration, we may find an abundance of proof among the higher forms of the lower animals. Among the animals, we find many instances of the power of charming or fascinating, both of which I hold to be but varying forms of manifestation of mental fascination, as I use the term, i.e., the action of a mental force that powerfully influences the imagination, desire, or will of another. This mental fascination among the animals manifests along two lines, viz., 1. Along the lines of desire operating in the direction of sex manifestation, such as the winning of mates, etc., and 2. Along the lines of will operation in the direction of overcoming the prey of the animal, such as the charming of birds by serpents, or of the smaller animals by tigers, etc. These cases are capable of liberal illustration and proof, and natural history affords us full authority for accepting the same. Instances of animal fascination. I recently read an account of a naturalist who related that one day in a tropical country he noticed a winged insect circling around and around a scorpion. After a bit, the insect made a series of desperate plunges at the scorpion, as if in a frantic desire to terminate the charm. The scorpion soon striking down the insect and afterwards devouring it. It is related by travelers that when one comes suddenly in the presence of a lion, tiger, or leopard, his legs seem paralyzed, and the eyes of the beast seem to exert a peculiar fascination and power over him. I have seen a mouse manifest the same emotion in the presence of a cat, and the same is true of a rat in the presence of a ferret or similar enemy. On the other hand, every observer has noticed the wonderful charming power that animals exert over others of their kind, of the opposite sex. If you have ever witnessed the courting of a bird during the mating season, you will have a keen sense of the reality of the power employed. One of the birds, and it may be either the male or female, will be seen to actually fascinate or charm the one of the opposite sex, the latter lying still with quivering wings and a helpless expression in its eyes. When compared with the attitude of the same bird when charmed by a serpent, the resemblance will be striking. Scientific testimony. I have before me a book written in 1847 which relates quite a number of instances in the operation of mental fascination among the lower animals. I will give you a few of them, condensed and abbreviated. Professor Silliman is quoted as stating that one day, while crossing the Hudson River at Catskill, he passed along a narrow road with the river on one side and a steep bank covered by bushes on the other side. His attention was attracted by the sight of a number of birds of a variety of species who were flying forward and backwards across the road, turning and wheeling in strange gyrations and with noisy chirpings, seemingly centering over a particular point of the road. Upon examination, the professor found an enormous black snake, partly coiled and partly erect, showing an appearance of great animation, with his eyes flashing like a brilliant diamond and his tongue darting in and out. The snake was the center of the motion of the birds. The professor adds that although the snake disappeared in the bushes, frightened at the approach of the men, still the birds seemed too dazed to escape, and perched on the nearby bushes, evidently awaiting the reappearance of their charmer. The charming by snakes. The same book relates an incident of a man in Pennsylvania who saw a large black snake charming a bird. The bird described gradually decreasing circles around the snake, at the same time uttering piteous cries. It seemed almost ready to drop into the jaws of the snake when the man drove off the latter, when the bird arose with a song of joy. Another case is related of a ground squirrel, which was observed running to and fro between a creek and a large tree a few yards distant. The squirrel's fur was badly ruffled, and he exhibited fright and distress. Investigation disclosed the head and neck of a rattlesnake protruding from the hole of the tree and pointing directly at the squirrel. The poor squirrel at last gave up the fight, and yielding to the fascination, laid himself down with his head very close to the snake's mouth. The snake then proceeded to swallow the squirrel, when his meal was interrupted with a cut of a carriage whip in the hands of the observer, and the squirrel, released from the spell, ran briskly away. Interesting instances. Dr. Good is quoted as having made quite a study of the curious fascinating power that rattlesnakes manifest over small animals, such as birds, squirrels, and young hares, etc. He relates that these animals seem incapable of drawing their eyes away from those of the snake, and, although seemingly struggling to get away, they still gradually approach the snake, as though urged toward him or attracted by a power superior to their natural instincts. He goes on to state that the animals creep nearer and nearer until at last it is drawn into the serpent's mouth, which has been open all the while to receive them. Dr. Barrow is quoted as relating many instances of this kind known to peasants in all parts of the world. Valiant, the African traveler, tells of an instance in which he witnessed a shrike at the very act of being fascinated by a large snake at a distance, the fiery eyes and open mouth of which was gradually approaching the bird, the latter manifesting convulsive trembling and uttering piercing shrieks of distress. The traveler shot the snake, but upon picking up the bird he found it dead, killed either by fear or the power of the serpent, or perhaps by the violent breaking of the spell. He measured the distance between the snake and the bird, and found it to be 3½ feet. Strange stories. A case is related in one of the early reports of the Philosophical Society, in which a mouse was put in a cage with a viper by way of an experiment. The mouse at first seemed greatly agitated, which state was followed by a condition of fascination, the mouse drawing nearer and nearer to the viper, which remained motionless, with distended jaws and glistening eyes. The mouse finally actually entered the jaws of the viper and was devoured. Bruce, the African traveler, relates that the natives of an interior tribe seem to be protected by nature against the bite of scorpions and vipers. They are said to handle these creatures fearlessly, the latter seeming to be robbed of their power of resistance. He states that the creatures seem to sicken the moment they are touched by the natives, and are sometimes so exhausted by the invisible fascinating power that they perish shortly. He says, "I have constantly observed that however lively the viper was before, upon being seized by any of these barbarians, he seemed as if taken with sickness and feebleness, and frequently would shut his eyes, and would never turn his mouth toward the arm that held him." Snake charmer. Personally, I have seen a somewhat similar case. When I was a boy in Maryland, I knew of a farmhand who was called a snake charmer. How he did it I could never find out, but he would exert some kind of influence over all kinds of snakes, poisonous ones included, and would cause them to remain fascinated until with a quick movement he would grab them by the neck with his bare hands. This man generally carried a few pet snakes around with him for company. They seemed perfectly contented, and would poke their heads up out of his pocket in order to look at someone else with whom he might be talking. Fascinating fierce animals. The power of charming animals, dogs, and wild beasts is undoubtedly possessed by some men in varying degrees, and nearly everyone has known of men who could charm the wildest horses as if by magic. I have read of some burglars who seemed able to quiet the most ferocious watchdogs. The Swedish writer Lindekrantz tells of certain natives of Lapland who are possessed of some process of charming dogs to such an extent that they have been known to cow the most savage greyhound, causing him to fly from them with all the signs of abject fear. Many of my readers have seen or heard of the horse whisperers found in various parts of the country, who will shut themselves in a stable with a fierce horse, and by whispering to him will manage to tame him completely and make him passive to their will. Charmed by a snake. There are cases recorded in which men, who have been charmed by a snake, have afterwards given in their experience. One of these cases relates that a man was walking in his garden when he suddenly came into the presence of a snake, whose eyes gleamed in a peculiar manner. He found himself fascinated as if by a spell, and unable to withdraw his eyes from those of the creature. The snake, he stated afterward, seemed to begin to increase immensely in size, and assumed in rapid succession a mixture of brilliant colors. He grew dizzy, and would have fallen in the direction of the snake had not his wife approached, throwing her arms about him and breaking the spell. Another similar case is related in which a man found his companion standing still on the road, with his eyes fixed intently upon those of a large rattlesnake, which was regarding him fixedly with gleaming eyes, scintillating in its raised head. The man was leaning toward the snake, and would have fallen toward it in a few moments. He was crying feebly but piteously, "He will bite me! He will kill me!" "Sure he will," replied his friend. "Why don't you run away? Why are you staying here?" But the man seemed perfectly dazed and distracted and could not answer. The companion finally picked up a stick and struck at the snake, which glided away savagely. The fascinated man was sick for several hours afterward. A personal experience. When I was a boy, I had somewhat similar experience, although not nearly so serious. Walking one day among a grove of trees belonging to my grandfather, I found myself standing, staring intently at a snake about 2 feet long, whose eyes glistened like large diamonds. In a moment, I ceased to see anything but those awful eyes, which glistened and displayed all the prismatic colors to my frightened glance. It lasted but a moment, however, for the snake glided away, seemingly as anxious to get away from me as I was to part company with him. I cannot say whether the spell would have been broken by me if the snake had not moved away. Perhaps it might, or perhaps not. All that I remember now, after the passage of 35 years or more, is that I did not seem to feel fear after the first shock, my feeling and emotion seemingly being that of great wonder and amazement arising from what I saw in those eyes. An elemental force. But I have said enough regarding the manifestation of mental fascination among the lower animals. There are many interesting instances of this sort scattered through the pages of books on animal life, and nearly everyone who has lived in the woods or among wildlife knows of many cases illustrating this fact, which have come under his own observation. I have mentioned these features of the subject merely for the purpose of showing you that we have to deal with a general natural principle which manifests throughout all life. This book has to deal with the manifestation of this force among men, but in closing this chapter, I would ask you to notice the resemblance between the manifestation of the force among the animals on the one hand, and among mankind on the other. The animals employ the force for 2 purposes, i.e., the captivating of mates and the capture of prey. And how do men and women use it? Among similar lines? Yes, I mean this as startling as it may appear. For is not the use of fascination in the direction of attracting the opposite sex akin to the sex charming noticed among the birds and animals? And is not the use of fascination in the direction of influencing men and women along the lines of business or personal interest akin to the charming of prey by wild animals, serpents, etc.? You may see that evolution simply changes the form of use in this and other natural qualities and power, the force or power remaining the same under all of the changes. And does it not become important for us to understand, study, and guard ourselves against the employment of such an elemental force as this, which manifests along all planes of life from lowest to highest? I emphatically answer yes. The story of mental fascination. The story of mental fascination runs along with the history of the human race, for it has always been known to man in some form. Coming to primitive man along with other inheritances from still lower forms, it was used from the beginning. Its earliest forms were similar to its employment by the lower animals, such as has been mentioned in the preceding chapter. The strong-willed of the race influenced and dominated the weaker-willed ones. Without understanding its laws, the strong-willed barbarians discovered that they possessed a strange power of inducing mental states among their weaker-willed companions, and were thus enabled to work their will upon them. Many of the leaders of barbarian races owe their positions of prominence and leadership to this law of mental induction. The magic of the priests. But along with the rise of leaders, there was manifested a similar rise in power and influence of the priests. All races have had their priests, and have today. A priest is a man whose office is that of a mediator between men and their divinities, one who claims to represent the supernatural entities in their dealings with men, a religious or spiritual middleman, as it were. I use this expression in all seriousness and with no desire to sneer at the priestly offices, which have played an important part in the history of the race. The priests, not being occupied with warfare or agriculture, and by reason of their support being contributed by the people, found plenty of time to think, a somewhat rare privilege in the early days, and even in these times for that matter. And so there gradually arose among all peoples a priestly caste that possessed the bulk of intelligence of the race. These priests soon began to recognize the importance of the mental forces, and they studied the underlying principles and laws of operation. This, of course, gave them an additional hold on the people and a power over them. There seems to be no doubt but that even in the early days of the race, the priestly caste held a very wide knowledge of the laws and practice of mental fascination. Mystic powers. In the heart of Africa today, we find the voodoo men, or conjurers, or medicine men, well versed in the application of mental fascination. It was known among the early American Indians, although their degenerated descendants seem to have lost the knowledge, except in a few instances. The power of the priesthood among primitive races is based almost entirely upon some form of mental fascination. And as we see the race ascending in the scale, so do we see the priests displaying a broader and fuller knowledge of the subject in question. The history of the Oriental races show that a full knowledge of the operation of mental fascination has been possessed by them for thousands of years. In the pictured stories of the Egyptians, the traces of which appear in the ruined temples and other buildings, we see that they understood the art perfectly. In ancient Persia and Chaldea, the art arose to great heights. In fact, among all of the advanced ancient races of men, we find an important place given to the subject before us. The ancient mysteries. Among the ancient mysteries, the various ceremonies of the temples of the early races, we see many instances of the use of mental fascination. Back of the rites and ceremonies was always the same underlying principle of mentative induction. In the early use of the force, its employment was largely along the lines of healing, which phase of the subject does not concern us in this particular manual, although it belongs to the general subject of mental magic. But still we read in the pages of early history of many instances of mental fascination, pure and simple. That which was afterward called mesmerism, hypnotism, etc., was well known to the ancients, and, in fact, some of the recorded results coming down to us from the past have never been equaled by modern experimenters. Some of the feats of the modern Hindu magicians, or fakirs, which will be mentioned in detail as we proceed, have never been equaled by Western hypnotists. The Tale of the Magi. As I have stated in Lesson 4 of Mental Magic, the name magnet given to the lodestone or natural magnet was bestowed by the ancients because the observed properties of the lodestone resembled the mental power of the Magi, or esoteric priesthood of ancient Persia and Media. These priests were the Magi, or wise men of the East, who had developed wonderful mentative powers and who were known as wonder workers. The word magic comes from the same source. When the attracting power and quality of induction of the lodestone were noticed, it was remarked that the physical phenomena closely resembled the mental phenomena of the Magi, and therefore the lodestone was called the Magian stone, or the magic stone, from which sprung the terms magnet and magnetism. As the centuries rolled by and the Western world had its attention called to the mysterious phenomena of mesmerism, etc., in the 18th century, the public mind instinctively connected the phenomena with that of magnetism, and the terms animal magnetism, personal magnetism, etc., came into general use. And these terms persist to this day, and we hear the terms very magnetic, lacking magnetism, magnetic personality, etc., etc., as applied to people. And so history worked out an instance of the law of compensation. The magnet, which took its name because its properties resembled the phenomena resulting from the use of mentative influence by the Magi, repaid the debt after many centuries and served to give a name to mental manifestations resembling those of the Magi in the dim past. The magnet gives back to the modern Magi the name it borrowed from the Magi of ancient Persia. This is an interesting bit of occult history, little known to the general public. Julius Caesar's fascination. Ancient history is full of instances of the operation of mental fascination among the people of the early days. It is related that Julius Caesar, while quite a young man, fell in with pirates near the Isle of Rhodes, who captured his ship and took him prisoner. They held him for several weeks while awaiting the ransom money being raised by his relatives. Plutarch writes that while the young Caesar was a captive of the pirates, he asserted his mastery over them to such an extent that he seemed a ruler rather than a prisoner. When he wished to rest or sleep, he forbade them to make any noise, and they obeyed him without question. He abused them and ordered them around like servants, and they did not seem to disobey him. He did not hesitate to threaten them with death when he regained his liberty, and they did not resent it, and he afterward made good his threat. The mystic power of Alcibiades. It is related of Alcibiades the Athenian that he once made a bet with some of the young Athenian nobles that he would publicly box the ears of Hipponicus, a venerable and greatly respected citizen. Not only did he bet that he would do this thing, but he also claimed that he would afterward compel the old man to give him his favorite daughter in marriage. The day following, when Hipponicus came out, Alcibiades walked up to him and gave him a resounding box on the ears. The old man seemed dazed and bewildered and retired to his home. A great public outcry arose, and the young man seemed likely to fall a victim to the indignation of the citizens. But the next day, Alcibiades went to the home of Hipponicus, and, after making a pretense of baring his back for punishment, he managed to induce in the old man a feeling of good humor and mirth, and obtained his pardon and goodwill, the latter increasing daily thereafter until finally he grew so devoted to the young man that he offered him the hand of his daughter in marriage, which was accepted. Anyone who is acquainted with the recorded character of the Athenians will realize what a wonderful occurrence this was. It was a striking exhibition of mental fascination, without a question. The Napoleonic charm. All the great generals of history have possessed this quality. Caesar, Alexander the Great, Napoleon, Frederick the Great, and the modern mystic warrior General Gordon all managed their men in a mysterious and wonderful manner so that their troops worshipped them as almost gods, and went to their death willingly and joyfully. The single instance of Napoleon when he returned from Elba and confronted the Bourbon army drawn up to capture him should satisfy anyone of the possession of the greatest fascinating power by this wonderful man. You remember that the troops were drawn up confronting Napoleon, their muskets leveled at his breast in obedience to the command, "Aim." Napoleon, who was on foot, marched deliberately toward the troops with measured tread, gazing directly into their eyes. Then the officers shouted, "Fire!" A single shot would have killed Napoleon, and would have brought to the man who fired it a fortune from the Bourbon king. But not a man obeyed the order. So completely were they under the spell of Napoleon's fascination. Instead of firing, they threw down their guns and ran joyfully toward the Corsicans, shouting, "Vive l'Empereur!" Their officers fled, and Napoleon, placing himself at the head of the troops, marched onto Paris. Other troops flocked to his standard at each point where he confronted them, although they had been sent out to capture or kill him. By the time the gate of Paris were reached, he was at the head of an immense army. The fascination manifested by this man was one of the marked instances of its possession of which we have any record, and it seems to endure to this day, almost a century after his death. The very mention of his name makes one's blood tingle. Modern examples. All great leaders of men, statesmen, orators, politicians, etc., have the power of mental fascination developed to a considerable degree. If you have ever come in contact with a man of this sort, you will always remember the impression he made upon you. Every man who knew James G. Blaine will remember his personal magnetism, of which so much was said during his lifetime. Anyone who heard the famous speech of William J. Bryan at the Chicago Convention, in which he made use of the famous expression, "Thou shalt not press upon the brow of labor the crown of thorns, thou shalt not crucify mankind upon the cross of gold," needs no further proof of the reality of mental fascination. Bryan was almost unknown to the majority of the delegates, and no thought of nominating him was entertained by them, but his magnetism was so great that it swept the convention like a mighty tidal wave, carrying all before it, and Bryan was carried around the hall on the shoulders of the delegates, who afterward made him their nominee for president. And although defeated twice, this man still possesses a wonderful fascination over hundreds of thousands of people in this country, who would rally around his standard at any time that he would sound the call. Henry Ward Beecher, at the great meeting in England, manifested the same power. The whole meeting was against him, and drowned his words by hoots, yells, and other noises, but Beecher looked them straight in the eye and gradually cowed them into subjection, and then talked to them for 2 hours and fairly carried the meeting by storm. He was but one man facing thousands of other men hostile to him and determined to prevent him from speaking, but the single man won by the power of his mental fascination, manifesting in the phase of will. It was not alone the words. In these cases, it was the will behind the words. The will is an actual living force, and is one of the 2 great phases or poles of mental fascination. Mesmer and his work. Coming down to the latter part of the 18th century, and omitting all reference to the phenomena of mental fascination recorded in the Middle Ages, we reach what may be called the beginning of the revival of the subject among the Western peoples. I allude to the work of Frederick Anton Mesmer, a man who understood far more than he taught, but who was regarded as a charlatan and a trickster by the ignorant, learned men of his day. Those who are informed regarding the secret history of Mesmer know that he was an occultist of no mean attainments, who was compelled to cloak his real teachings with popular theories and sensational phenomena in order to gain the attention of the world and also to escape religious persecutions. Mesmer was born in 1734, and in 1775 began his work in Vienna by writing and teaching about a mysterious universal fluid which was able to control the wills of people and also cure them of diseases, and which could be controlled and operated by man. He taught that there was a universal fluid which permeated everything and was capable of receiving and communicating all kinds of motions and impressions. This fluid, he thought, acted immediately upon the nerves, in which it is embodied and produced in the human body phenomena, similar to that of the lodestone or magnet. He called this fluid animal magnetism. He taught that this magnetism flowed rapidly from body to body, acted at a distance, was reflected by a mirror like light, etc., etc. Mesmer attracted to himself great attention and great abuse. On the one hand, he was sneered and scoffed at, and also driven out of the church for possessing the power of the devil and witchcraft. But on the other hand, he gathered around him a body of supporters and students. He was investigated by a royal commission and by scientific bodies with varying results. The coming of the French Revolution interfered with a general interest in the subject for a number of years. Mesmer's followers adhered to his general lines of theory and practice with unimportant additions or changes. The Abbé Faria. In 1814, the Abbé Faria attracted much interest in Paris. His theories were different from those of Mesmer inasmuch as he claimed that the sleep produced by Mesmer and his followers was not the result of any outside force, but was caused by the patient himself. For a number of years, a spirited contest was waged between the two schools of mesmerists, and much bad feeling was developed. Braid and hypnotism. Then came James Braid, the Manchester surgeon, who proceeded to tear down the accepted theories, substituting one of his own. Braid may be called the father of hypnotism, the term being first employed in connection with his work. His theory was that there was no such thing as animal magnetism, but the phenomena obtained by Mesmer and his followers were caused by a physiological condition brought about by physical means, such as fixing the eyes, rigidity of the muscles, etc. Braid made some very important contributions to the knowledge on the subject, although of course all that he wrote or taught was colored by his own particular theories. Braid regarded the hypnotic sleep produced by his methods as the necessary condition and cause of the phenomena of animal magnetism. Braid's writings brought the subject before the attention of physicians who had up to his time avoided it as unprofessional, etc., and a series of investigations by medical men in France and Germany were begun, and have continued up to this time. The result of such investigation has been the placing of the subject upon a scientific basis. Lebu and suggestion. Dr. Lebu of the school of Nancy, France, first brought into prominence the theory of suggestion, which has since found so many followers. Dr. Burnham, a pupil of Lebu in his work, Suggestive Therapeutics, carried his teacher's theories on still further. The theory of suggestion, as taught by Lebu and Burnham, was that the cause of the phenomena of mesmerism and animal magnetism, etc., lay in the verbal suggestion or verbal command of the hypnotist to the subject, given and received while the subject was in a deep hypnotic sleep. This hypnotic sleep was considered to be an essential and fundamental prerequisite of the phenomena. It was all sleep, with the teachers, students, and investigators at that day, and the majority of them are still under the spell of the old teachings. Burnham's mistake. As an instance of how near a man may come to a thing and still miss it, I may mention that Burnham has recorded that in rare cases, where the conditions were exceptionally favorable, he could obtain results even when the subject was not asleep. But he missed his opportunity of following up this promising lead, and to the end he proceeded upon the belief and theory that the hypnotic sleep was a necessary precedent to the phenomena obtained. He endeavored to produce the condition of deep sleep, or profound hypnosis, believing that the same was a necessary condition for suggestibility. The very word hypnosis arises from the Greek word meaning to lull to sleep. So you can see how deeply this idea of sleep was and is among hypnotists. Remember this always, please. Hypnosis means a condition of sleep, so never use the word in any other way. Mental fascination is not hypnosis, although hypnosis is a form of application of mental fascination. The New School. During the past 10 years or so, there has arisen a new school of investigators of the phenomena of mesmerism, etc. This new school proceeds upon the theory that the hypnotic sleep is merely an incident, and that all the phenomena obtained by the earlier authorities is possible without the production of a sleep condition. In other words, sleep is not a necessary condition of suggestibility. This brings a new school of the suggestionists very near to the occult idea of mental fascination, although there are some radical differences, as I shall show in a moment. In 1884, Dr. Bremand announced that he had made the discovery that there is a fourth hypnotic state, which he called fascination, which left the subject in full consciousness of his surroundings and remembrance of what had taken place. If Bremand had only had the courage to omit the fetish word hypnotic from his statement, he would have founded a new school, but he didn't. The German Frohman wrote a large book on the subject of fascination, which he defined as hypnotism without the putting to sleep. The truth about suggestion. Some of the best work along the without sleep hypnotism has been done by American experimenters and investigators, principally physicians, nearly all of whom believe that suggestion is the explanation of the whole thing, and that there is no such thing as a passage of mental currents. These suggestionists hold that the subject acts upon the command and suggestion and does what he is told, and that is all there is to it. The suggestible condition to them means a condition in which the subject yields up his whole attention to the operator, and thus becomes suggestible, the degrees varying with the temperament, etc. of the subject. While the suggestionists believe that suggestion is a whole explanation and cause, I hold that it is but one of the methods of producing the effects, and that back of suggestion is the induction of the mental state by the suggester, as I have stated in my work on mental magic, and as I shall bring out in the present manual. Personal magnetism. Along with the new theories of suggestion without sleep, there has arisen a great interest in personal magnetism during the past few years. There has been much written on the subject, some good and some ridiculous, and some between the two extremes. The laws of the subject are being studied by the thinking public. There has been a great revival in the interest in occultism, which, together with the various phases of mental science, theosophy, new thought, and kindred subjects, has attracted the attention of a large portion of the public to the general subject of mental magic, and to the special subject of mental fascination in particular. And this manual is written in response to the present demand for definite information on the subject. I feel sure that I will be able to show you that the law of mentative energy, in its operation along the line of mentative currents as stated in my book on mental magic, will account for all the phenomena mentioned above in the history of the general subject, as well as many other forms. I believe that I can bring it all under the definition of the action of a mental force that powerfully influences the imagination, desire, or will of another, which is my definition of mental fascination.